They call it the Third Crusade, a war of kings, saints, and legends. On one side stood Richard the Lionheart, who believed that glory could bend history itself. On the other, Saladin, the master strategist, who knew that in war, victory doesn't belong to the strongest, but to the most patient mind. But what if I told you both were right? Only one fought to be remembered. The other fought to win. When pride clashes with strategy, when faith meets calculation, which leader truly understands the nature of war? To find out, we return to 1191, to the blood-soaked walls of Acre, where the real battle wasn't fought with swords, but with minds. In 1191, Richard the Lionheart arrived in the Holy Land to face Saladin at the brutal siege of Acre. Most historians focus on the clash of arms, the catapults, the sapping of the walls, the mass charges, but the real battle wasn't fought with steel. It was fought here, points to head. It was a war between the cult of personal glory and the calculus of strategic patience, and victory would go to the commander who could master not only his own army, but the mind of his enemy. The Third Crusade is often romanticized as the polite war, a conflict defined by the mutual respect and chivalry of its two great protagonists. This is a dangerous simplification. In the psychological warfare between Richard and Saladin, honor was not a restraint, it was a weapon. To understand Richard, we must first discard the modern concept of a king. He was not a head of state. He was the head of a fractious, temporary coalition. His authority over the other leaders of the Crusade, like Philip of France or Leopold of Austria, was tenuous, built not on institutional power, but on personal reputation. Here, we see Richard's code for what it truly is: a mechanism for coalition management. His legendary prowess, his insistence on fighting in the front ranks, his desire for single combat. This was not just ego, though the ego was immense. It was a calculated psychological performance. He had to embody the Crusader ideal so completely, so terrifyingly, that lesser nobles would be shamed, inspired, or intimidated into following his lead. His chivalry was a tool for projecting coercive charisma. It was designed to dominate his allies just as much as his enemies. His entire leadership philosophy was based on the legende, the glorious moment that proves divinity and right to rule. Saladin's challenge was symmetrical. He, too, was a unifier, an architect of the Ayyubid dynasty who had painstakingly forged an empire from bickering emirates. His authority was also contingent, but where Richard projected strength through prowess, Saladin projected it through piety and magnanimity. When he retook Jerusalem in 1187, he famously offered generous terms and forbade a massacre, a decision that stood in stark, calculated contrast to the bloodbath of the First Crusade. This was not simple kindness. It was a masterful act of psychological warfare. To his own people, it cemented his image as the just and merciful defender of the faith. To the local Christians and his own rivals, it established a new strategic narrative. Saladin was a ruler one could surrender to. His honor was a psyop designed to lower the psychological cost of defeat, making surrender a viable option and saving him the blood and treasure of countless costly sieges. So, as the Third Crusade begins, we have two masters of reputation. Richard, the performer, relies on impulsive, high-visibility acts of glory. Saladin, the strategist, relies on patient, systemic acts of mercy. It is a clash between a mind built for the decisive battle and a mind built for the protracted war. And at the fortress of Acre, the strain of a 2-year siege is about to force Richard's hand, revealing the profound, cognitive flaw hidden within his code of honor. When Acre finally fell in July 1191, it was a staggering victory for the Crusade. But it was also a psychological trap. The siege had been a 2-year nightmare of disease, attrition, and stalemate. For Richard, a commander constitutionally incapable of inaction, it was a source of profound agitation. He had not come to the Holy Land to dig trenches. He had come to win glory. Saladin, understanding this, engaged in protracted ransom negotiations for the captured garrison. He played for time, offering exchanges, partial payments, anything to slow the Crusader momentum. This delay pressed directly on Richard's central cognitive flaw: his impatience. His army was not a standing professional force. It was a volatile collection of glory seekers and mercenaries, funded at immense personal cost, and it was dissolving daily from sickness and desertion. He could not afford a long negotiation. What happened next is often cited as the great stain on Richard's honor. On August 20th, he ordered the execution of nearly 3,000 Muslim prisoners, men, women, and children, on a plain outside the city, in full view of Saladin's army. This was not a fit of blind rage. It was a cold, brutal, psychological calculation. It was a message, sent in blood, directly to Saladin. The war of delay is over. Your rules of chivalrous negotiation are void. I am not a rival king. I am a holy warrior, and I will wage a war of annihilation. Here, we see the dark side of Richard's leadership code. When his performance of charisma failed to manage the situation, he switched to a performance of terror. He was attempting to shock Saladin's psyche, to break his strategic calm and provoke him into a rash, decisive battle. But Saladin's mind did not break. He was horrified, but he was not provoked. He recognized the act for what it was, not a sign of strength, but a symptom of desperation. Richard was lashing out because his strategic clock was expiring. Saladin's response was a masterclass in psychological warfare. He did not retaliate in kind. Instead, he simply absorbed the blow and redoubled his core strategy. Attrition. The campaign that followed, the march down the coast toward Jaffa, became one of the great psychological duels in military history. Richard, a tactical genius, marched his army in a tight, defensive formation, the sea guarding one flank. His infantry and cavalry meticulously organized to repel attack. Saladin refused to give him the battle he craved. Instead, he unleashed a war on Richard's mind. His horse archers, the wasps of the desert, swarmed the Crusader column relentlessly. They did not attack to win, they attacked to harass. They targeted stragglers. They fired into the baggage train. They aimed at the horses, knowing that a dismounted knight was a liability. Every day was a grueling march under a barrage of arrows, heat, and thirst. Saladin's forces scorched the earth ahead, poisoning wells and destroying forage. This was not a conventional military operation. It was a targeted psychological assault on the cohesion of the Crusader coalition. Saladin knew Richard's center of gravity wasn't his heavy cavalry. It was his army's will to continue. The constant, low-level physical threat was designed to create maximum psychological friction, to fray the nerves of the European nobles, to make them curse this land and the king who had brought them there. At Arsuf, Richard's patience finally broke. Under severe provocation, his rearguard charged without orders. Richard, seeing the line break, had no choice. He counterattacked, leading a devastating charge that shattered Saladin's right flank. Tactically, it was a stunning victory, a perfect demonstration of Richard's brilliance in open battle. But strategically, it meant nothing. Saladin's army was not destroyed. It yielded, retreated inland, and regrouped. For Richard, Arsuf was a deep cognitive dissonance. He had won, just as his code demanded. He had proven his prowess. Yet, the war continued. Saladin had allowed him his glorious battle, knowing he could absorb the loss. This set the stage for the final psychological checkmate. Richard marched his army to within 12 miles of Jerusalem. He could see the holy city, and he stopped. He did it again months later, only to stop again. The man who had crossed a continent for this single objective was paralyzed. Why? Because Saladin had won. He had forced Richard to confront the impotence of his own philosophy. Richard, the warrior, knew he could take the city. But Richard, the king, knew he could not hold it. His coalition was fractured. His supply lines were non-existent. The moment he took Jerusalem, most of the Crusaders would fulfill their vows and go home, leaving him to face a unified, surrounding enemy. Saladin had forced him to see that his entire concept of war, the glorious, decisive battle, was useless against an enemy who refused to be decisively beaten and who controlled the strategic realities of supply, terrain, and popular support. The Lionheart's mind, built for the sprint, had been broken by a marathon. Here, we must be precise. Richard the Lionheart did not lose the Third Crusade in a conventional sense. He was a tactical supernova, unbeaten in every major engagement. He retook the entire coast, refortified its cities, and smashed Saladin's finest forces at Arsuf. By the metrics of his own chivalric code, he was a resounding success. But Saladin was playing a different game. He wasn't trying to win a battle. He was trying to exhaust a psychology. He correctly diagnosed that Richard's leadership and the entire Crusader coalition was an event-driven phenomenon. It required constant, forward-moving, glorious victories to maintain its cohesion. Saladin's entire strategy was to deny Richard a narrative climax. By refusing to be shattered at Arsuf, by scorching the earth, and by refusing to stake his empire on a single defense of Jerusalem, Saladin shifted the conflict from a physical one to a cognitive one. He forced Richard to stop and think. And in that moment of hesitation, 12 miles from the Holy City, Richard was confronted by a logic greater than his own ambition. He was a warrior king, not an occupying governor. He had a kingdom in England to reclaim and a reputation to protect. Saladin had simply made the price of victory, psychologically, financially, and strategically untenable. The final treaty was the ultimate strategic concession. Richard, the man who came to conquer, was reduced to negotiating access for unarmed pilgrims. Saladin, the man who had lost every battle, retained control of Jerusalem and the strategic interior. In this war of rival minds, the tactical genius was defeated by the psychological strategist. Saladin won by absorbing every blow, frustrating every impulse, and patiently exploiting his enemy's greatest strength, his need for glory, as his most predictable weakness. He forced the Lionheart to accept that some wars are not won by those who fight best, but by those who understand why they are fighting and what they are willing to endure. Saladin's patience secured the strategic victory. Yet, it is Richard's legend, his tactical prowess that endures in Western memory. As a leader, which is the more powerful legacy? The unglamorous reality of a war won, or the inspiring myth of a glorious fight? Share your strategic assessment in the comments below.